Oh, yeah.
Ah, thank you, okay. Ooh. Getting the full work over here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hands up if you can't. Good. Here's a tale for those of you who believe New Zealand to be a small country. Michael and I both hail from Canterbury, are roughly the same age, have worked as freelance musicians in New Zealand for almost 40 years, and have even collaborated on a couple of projects. Here's the funny thing, despite all this, we've never met. So forgive me for a moment while I say hello, Michael. Nice to meet you. And I think I know the lecturer you were talking about, but I was there a year after you. Thanks for opening this Lilburn's Legacy Fostering Musical Creativity Conference so aptly and expertly. Bach was indeed a composer close to Douglas's heart, both as an admiring listener and, as Louise rightly said, for the pleasure his music brought him as an extremely proficient hobby pianist. For testimony to this admiration, we need look no further than Douglas's own funeral service. A seemingly morbid thought, I agree, but it was a service he planned well in advance with diligence, flair, and a remarkable amount of good cheer. Douglas only chose 2 composers to be represented at his funeral, and despite a lifetime of writing and advocating for contemporary composition, the most modern of these was Beethoven, chosen for his Archduke, Movement 1. The other composer was J.S. Bach, selected for his Brandenburg, number 1, the adagio of which Douglas requested to be played during the service, and selected portions of the 4th movement at the close. Such was his love and knowledge of the score that he even specified the exact moment at which he wished his coffin to exit. Bar 25 of the Plaka. This timing, typically thoughtful of the man, ensured that the congregation could, quote, be led out to the cheerful sounds of the second trio. Now, if it seems a trifle bleak to begin a keynote address at a conference held in honour of someone by referring to his funeral plans, I'd have to agree. But of course, our conference is about a legacy, and by definition, a legacy can only follow a death or a departure. In Douglas's case, his is an astonishing legacy, the richness of which we will only be able to hint at over the next few days. If he left a message behind for us, for the beneficiaries of his legacy, and that in one way or another includes all of us here, it was surely in his choice of reading at the funeral service, Psalm 90. For 1,000 years in thy sight are but as yesterday when it is past, and as a watch in the night. In other words, carpe diem, put to good use the time you have, rather than lamenting the time you don't have. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is exactly what I intend to do with the remaining time I have for this address. Thank you, Rosemary and Louise and members of the conference convening committee for inviting me, and thank you for your kind introductions. I should have employed you both as my publicist because I'm really useless at the job, so I'll see you afterwards about that one. May I say it's an honour to be keynote speaker at an annual conference of New Zealand's most venerable music organisation. I'm being serious about the venerable, for there are only 2 music organisations in New Zealand that exist courtesy of a government statute. And Rumpty, if I may be permitted to refer to it as such, is the elder statesman. The other, a mere babe in arms by comparison, is the NZSO. Incidentally, before I forget, does anyone know where the archives of the IRMT are? I'm working on a book project, and you'd be amazed at how many times I've encountered Rumpty's name. Any tips or hints where they may be, I'd be most grateful. Back to the matter in hand. This is a conference in honour of Douglas's legacy, but my assignment tonight is not to talk about Douglas. That comes tomorrow morning in spades. But to speak more generally about the opportunities and inspirations, or lack thereof, that have helped foster my own musical creativity, or lack thereof, as a freelance composer living and working in New Zealand. Someone once said to me that being a composer in New Zealand must be like being a matador in Finland. This may be so, for I know nothing of bovine belligerence in the land of the midnight sun, nor of opportunities to counter it. But not having heard of something and not knowing it doesn't exist are two separate things, and not to be confused, as is often the case with being a composer in New Zealand. I've recently taken to describing composition as the invisible art, partly because it's the art form you don't see. You can see the blueprint for a composition in the form of a notated score, but the composition itself exists only in a fragment of time, as the largely preordained interweaving of sound waves we call a performance. That is the literal invisibility of composition. The figurative invisibility is the almost complete lack of public profile of its living exponents. When I first became interested in the work of other New Zealand composers in the late 1970s, I'd make a point of asking members of any group I was addressing to write down the names of as many New Zealand composers as they could think of. I'd then add up the names and average them out amongst the respondents. Invariably, the average would come out approximately the same, 1.5. People could think 1.5 New Zealand composers off the tops of their head. That was 30 years ago. I tried the same question recently in Christchurch and was delighted to find things had improved dramatically. 2.5. People on average could now think of 2.5 New Zealand composers off the tops of their heads. Now that I have you all thinking, help, how many New Zealand composers can I name, and is he going to ask me to name them? You'll be delighted to know that the answer is no, I'm not. But I would like you all to turn to the person sitting next to you, introduce yourself, and tell them the names of 5 New Zealand composers. I think it's only fitting that members of Rumpty should be able to muster twice the national average. For the purpose of this exercise, any composer born in New Zealand or residing here or is alive or half dead or somewhere in between can qualify. You've already started, but I'll let you have another minute. Okay, we'll let that question lie. About the same time as I began frightening audiences with questions about how many New Zealand composers they knew, I helped establish a journal for the Composers Association of New Zealand called Canzona. I'm sure you've all heard of it, then again perhaps not, though it's still running, if a tad late. I was its first editor and wanted to start a letters to the editor column. So I did what editors the world over do in such cases. I wrote a letter to myself. I pretended to be a school student searching for information on a science project. Dear Sir, I'm at present in the 4th form studying anaerobic microbiology at a secondary school whose name I haven't yet learnt to spell. The other day, my teacher, male, Caucasian, set our class a project on the reproductive habits of the phylum Composer, with particular reference to New Zealand's subgenus. Can you please help me? I've looked everywhere for information to little avail. Is the species endangered? What does it do when not producing? Does the New Zealand composer have any characteristics that distinguish it from its continental counterparts? Yours, etc., Gail Creant, Miss. To this I replied, Dear Miss Creant, the particular species you are after is, in most cases, a nocturnal creature, surviving during the daylight hours solely on its chameleon-like ability to assume the guise of an ordinary working person. The only surefire method of catching a glimpse of one is by dangling juicy commissions from state olive branches. Yours, Ed, Mr. While not the high-tide mark of literary endeavour for the journal, the letter served several useful purposes. Firstly, it ensured all future letters to the editor would appear scholarly by comparison. Second, it allowed me to justify publishing a reference list of articles on New Zealand composers I had handily just compiled. Thirdly, it's provided a stake in the ground to measure how far we've come in 35 years, For however tongue-in-cheek my assessment may have been, it was a reasonably accurate snapshot of the New Zealand composer's lot, circa 1979. Back then, the notion of working as a freelance composer was not considered the product of a sound mind. Few composers, if any, pursued composition as a career. Most had more sense. Yet, certifiable optimist that I am, there was obviously something in the air that persuaded me to take a leap of faith, to chance my arm like the bullfighter in Finland, as a composer in a land noted for its rugby, racing and beer, but not its music. Over the course of my career, I've often been asked what it's like to be a composer. A few years ago, I decided to compose a response to this question. I called my composition Murphy's Law. Each of the three movements named after a law of human nature that seemed to sum up a particular challenge for someone wanting to work as a composer. Movement 1, and the piece itself, is named Murphy's Law number 2. Everything takes longer than you expect. This is one of the few certainties in the uncertain world of composition. Composition is a slow business. However long one sets aside for completing a work, there's never enough time to finish it to one's satisfaction. This is a truth shared by any occupation that involves the administration of vast amounts of detail, not to mention creating something to a standard of excellence without having any objective measurement of what excellence means. Movement 2 I called Locke's Law, so true of any occupation that operates in the public eye and whose success depends on public approval. The law is named after an American congressman who had just suffered defeat in an election. Congressman Locke was heard to reflect, "One day you're a peacock, the next day you're a feather duster." Movement 3 I called the QWERTY factor, a law named after the fact that there's no logical explanation why a layout for a typewriter keys beginning with the letters Q, W, E, R, T, Y should become the standard for typewriters instead of any other number of arguably better layouts. In the world of composition, there's often no accounting for taste, why one particular composition or composers gather the accolades while others are overlooked. This is appropriate to any occupation where perception rather than reality is the crucial factor. The product that meets with success is not necessarily the best one, but the one that's best presented to the market. The name of the game is publicity. Had I written a fourth movement, I was intending to call it Micawber's first law of economics, a law to which anyone in a sunset occupation will relate to. For those of you unfamiliar with Dickens, Micawber's first law of economics is annual income £20, annual expenditure 19 and 6, result happiness. Annual income £20, annual expenditure £20 and 6pence, result misery. A few years ago I faced a class of year 11 music students at a school in Christchurch. I was appearing in the flesh, so to speak, at the end of a teaching module in which the students had sung and studied one of my compositions. They were ready and armed with a quiver of questions to fire at me about what it was like to be a composer. I was impressed with the thoroughness of their questioning and preparation. Questions ranged from the psychological, why do you compose, to the sociological, who do you compose for? From the paranormal, do you go looking for inspiration or do you wait for it to hit you? To the contractual, who decides how much you get paid for each work? Obviously a lawyer's son, that one. There was also a nurture versus nature question. Are composers born or are they made? Most composers seem to come to composition at an early age, driven by an urge to communicate using sound. In my case, I'm fairly certain I was a born rather than a made composer. I spent too much time trying to dodge music practice as a youngster for it to be otherwise. My early passion was sport, and the first ambition I can remember was to be a professional cricketer. Music was an impediment to perfecting a square cut at lunchtime, and I'm not talking sandwiches. However, environment must have played some part, for there was always music in our house. My mother Faye was a pianist and music teacher, and my father John loved to sing. All four of us children played and sang, and I had lessons on the cello and the piano. I wasn't a good student and hated formal lessons. It was a happy day when I finally became an ex-student. I just scraped through my grade 3 piano exam, and my teacher, a Dickensian sort of a character, was heard to mutter with an earshot of my parents, "The devil looks after his own." You may empathise with the piano teacher. Oddly, my piano playing began to improve once the lesson stopped, though the meaning of the word improve is perhaps open to debate. I began to get a lot of satisfaction from exploring the keyboard in an improvisatory way. I developed an ear for the keyboard at the expense of an eye, and which soon led to explorations in composition. I was impatient for my repertoire as a pianist to expand, and I found it quicker to invent pieces of my own rather than learn pieces by others. By now I was at secondary school in Masterton. Amongst the staff, a crazy mix of moderates and misfits, we had a teacher who was a Gilbert and Sullivan fanatic. He mounted a show a year for several years. As a third former, there was the thrill of participating in my first large-scale show, Pirates of Penzance. I was the third of 3 cellists and entranced by the proceedings. By the 5th form, I was old and ugly enough to play one of the lead villains in Ruddigore. Rosemary was also in that production, but she's much younger than me. A friend in the cast, John Farnsworth, was similarly bitten by the musical theatre bug. We decided to have a go at writing a comic operetta. John and I happily whiled away many a holiday hour writing not 1, but 3 comic operettas over the remainder of our school days. One of these, a 1-act operetta called The 21st of the 49th, all about parliamentarians and women's liberationists, was produced in our final year at school. "Burn the bra, oh burn the bra," was one of the memorable lyric lines. I recall setting to music and enjoyed teaching the St Matthew's girls to sing. Encouraged by this experience, I enrolled in 1972, a year after Michael, in an arts degree back in Christchurch. The music students and staff at that time were a lively bunch, apart from one of them, and one of the first projects I was involved in was a production of Purcell's operatic masque, The Fairy Queen. I was fortunate to gain some solo roles, a drunken poet and a fairy. A very hairy fairy. The joy of performing in such a slick production, produced by a visiting English soprano, conducted by Professor John Ritchie, and starring such vocal luminaries as Keith Lewis and Judy Bellingham, confirmed that music theatre was my passion. I couldn't wait to compose something similar. From the sublime to the ridiculous, my opportunity came sooner than I could have hoped for. The very next year, I managed to persuade the Students' Music Club, MUSOC, to allow John Farnsworth and me to write an operetta for them, with Judy and Keith as leads. It had to be a spoof a la Hoffnung. Remember the musical cartoonist Gerard Hoffnung? And it had to have splashes of high camp, for both were de rigueur at the time. Thus, Cinderella and the Fairy Oddmother was born. The success of this show led to the following year to an even zanier production with the glorious title of Stiff Luck for the Undertaker. Thanks to the title, this went on to have almost 50 productions, mainly at schools around New Zealand in the late 70s, 80s and 90s. One of the last I can recall must have been in the mid-1990s, for one of the students came on stage and introduced the proceedings with, "Hello, this show was written in 1974. Most of us on stage tonight weren't even born then." For me, it was a wonderful collision of pride at having an early composition re-performed and the stark realisation that time had passed. I was now a generation older and being what I had only hoped to be back in 1974. A full-time practicing composer. To return to one of the questions I mentioned earlier, why do I compose? I'm often tempted to say that, like Johann Sebastian Bach, who also had many children, 5 times more than I, to be precise, I compose because I need the money. On one level, there's truth in this, for next to an impending deadline, there's nothing like running out of money to sharpen the mind and the creativity. But on another level, that's absurd, for if I were in composition for the money, I wouldn't have lasted in this business 40 days, let alone 40 years. No, there's some mysterious, compelling force that makes me and other composers put pen to paper in what's got to be one of the most challenging, frustrating, yet ultimately rewarding activities known to man or women. I know in my case it's linked with the joy of creating something that can speak meaningfully to listeners or performers, that either moves, entertains, or possibly enlightens them. The older I get, the more I delight in having an early work speak across the years. I had a case in point recently with the conservation song, The Earth We Share, I wrote in 1983 with A.K. Grant as part of the stage musical Footrock Flats. The song was sung a few years ago by 5,000 school children at one of the Christchurch Schools music festivals, and then shortly after by no less a body than the Vienna Boys Choir in Austria, Asia, and America. It's a real source of pleasure to have something I wrote 30 years ago communicating across a generation and with a message that's as relevant as ever. As Senator Locke, the plumage-plucked politician of my Murphy's Law, would attest, it's not possible to please all the people all the time. This fundamental law of human nature is no more evident than in the battle zone of musical aesthetics. Musical factions have warred from the earliest time, since one caveman hip-hop to a beatboxed rhythm, while another disemboweled a sun-dried cat and chanced upon the violin string. That there's no accounting for musical taste is a simple truth and relatively easy to illustrate. Hands up who likes listening to bagpipes. Case closed. I'm sure you're all familiar with Sir Thomas Beecham's definition of a true gentleman, someone who knows how to play the bagpipes but doesn't. Actually, I happen to rather like them. One of my most memorable experiences as a composer was writing for a festival of youth music held in Christchurch in 1990. All the national youth ensembles, orchestra, choir, brass band, jazz band, concert band and pipe band were in town, and my commission was to compose something for them all to play together. As 1990 was New Zealand's sesquicentennial year, I constructed a historical scenario that followed the fortunes of a fictitious pioneer called Settler McGee. The lyrics went something like, "This is the ballad of Settler McGee, who sailed for Australia in late 33, farewelled by the pipers on Aberdeen Quay, who still could be heard many miles out at sea. In Hobart he learned of some isles to the east from a sealer or whaler, a Methodist priest, sold all but a sporran to pay for the fare and landed in Auckland with little to wear. The tangata whenua welcomed him there, sold him some land, for they had some to spare. He braved the conditions, took all in his stride, made friends with the vendors, took one for his bride. The friendship was firmed in a tribal dispute. He learned how to haka, he taught how to shoot. At the close of the decade, a treaty was born. He was asked to be there when the nation was born. Sadly, the pitch of the treaty was queered as shiploads of land-hungry settlers appeared. It quickly lost meaning, discarded as dud, for treaties anew would be written in blood. It took many decades to rebuild the trust. The treaty, though sadly, remained undiscussed, left for a government way down the track, stored as a nut for descendants to crack. We left it there at 1990. The first combined rehearsal for Ballad of Settler McGee was for me an exhilarating musical moment. The power and splendour of the 400 instrumentalists and singers unified was a revelation. I remember reeling with pleasure, astonishment, pride, and a dozen other emotions at the sheer presence of the sound. One could almost touch it. It was that immediate. If ever I was seeking a reason why I composed, this was it. The payoff for the long hours, the minuscule monetary rewards, the indifference of arts administrators, and the puzzlement of the general public. Part of the excitement of being a composer over the years for me has been the challenge of taking a traditionally not-for-profit hobby and turning it into a not-for-profit career. In case you're interested, and even if you're not, there are two ways for professional composers to gain remuneration. One is from money secured to compose a piece in the form of a commission fee for writing particular work. The fee often comes through a third-party funding agency like Creative New Zealand. Commission fees are tricky to estimate. My rule of thumb for the time it takes to compose is 1 minute of completed music per day for a song, 1 minute of completed music per week for an orchestral work. And that's on the fast side for any work with a degree of complexity. There's a list of recommended fees published by the Composers Association of New Zealand. They're in the form of a sum per minute for particular quantities of score lines. For instance, if a bank manager wished to commission a composer to write a string quartet for his wife's birthday, he could expect to pay between $600 to $1,000 for each minute of the completed piece. If you'd like the full Monty, a fully orchestrated paean to love, marital devotion, and the joys of $1 million take-home pay before bonuses, anywhere between $1,000 and $2,000 per minute of completed product would be acceptable. Incidentally, in case you're thinking the birthday gift idea is a hypothetical situation, it has happened before. If you'd like to continue the trend, please see me afterwards. Actually, if I may be a little bit filled with pride, I was commissioned fully a few years back to compose a birthday gift, a work for solo flute to mark the 18th birthday of a promising young flautist. His parents wished to acknowledge his hard work and early success in his music, and they believed commissioning a piece especially for him was an appropriate and hopefully encouraging gift. I'm sure he would have preferred a car, but was decent enough not to voice this within my earshot. Anyway, fast forward 5 years, and I was delighted to discover only yesterday that the flautist and his trio will be touring with his trio for Chamber Music New Zealand this year, and he, Hugh Roberts, will be including my birthday music for solo flute in the program. The second path to remuneration is through money gained from royalties, from the sale of hire of published or recorded music, in which case the money arrives directly from the publishing or recording companies or from fees generated from performing or broadcasting the music. Where a composition's under 20 minutes long and not associated with a dramatic production, the royalty usually arrives through APRA, the Australasian Performing Rights Association. All I know is don't expect to get wealthy on royalties from APRA unless you're being frequently broadcast all around the globe. There are millions of APRA dollars to disperse, but gazillions of compositions competing for the share of the revenue. There's no recognition of the complexity of the music performed or even of whether anyone was listening or not. The return for live performances up till recently was a whopping 70 cents per minute of performed music, which means that if a professional orchestra performed a 5-minute overture of mine to a capacity crowd of 2,000 people, I could expect to earn $3.50 from the event, enough to make a down payment on purchasing a program for the concert. The NZSO, of course, have a higher rate of royalty from that, but that's pretty close to what it is in the provinces. However, if my overture was adopted by the Canterbury Crusaders as its theme song instead of Conquest of Paradise, I would soon become very wealthy, given the frequency with which that music is aired, the number of television networks it's broadcast on, and the fact that television broadcasts are remunerated at a higher rate than radio or live performances. My time's almost up. I'll seize the day and squeeze in a few quick answers to some of the other questions I've been asked over the years. Do I wait for inspiration to strike, or do I go hunting for it? One could wait indefinitely for inspiration to strike. I've noticed there's no rhyme or reason to when it does, and often it occurs when disparate ideas collide and bond. I've often likened the act of composition to problem solving. One day a problem's unsolvable, the next day the solution is so simple it's beyond belief one didn't think of it earlier. The human brain is a strange organ, capable of huge oversights one moment and penetrating insights the next. A freelance composer can't afford to sit around waiting too long. The longest I've sat is about a fortnight, trying to work out what lyrics would be suitable to set for a particular commission. I'm glad I waited for the ideal lyrics for my choral cycle Plum Song eventually suggested themselves. If you think that's long, Oscar Hammerson II once sat around for an entire fortnight searching for a single word in one of his lyrics. He got it in the end. Frankly, as I recall it, it wasn't worth a fortnight of time, but he was happy with that particular word. As I say, it's a slow business. Question, what genre would you label yourself as? An eclectic. I can listen to both the bagpipes and country and western and not break out in hives. I've also used both in my own composition. You've heard the bagpipe one, here's the country and western, or at least the lyrics of one of them. Now here's my shot at a cowboy song. It's for when you've been in the sun too long. There's only one chord, so you can't lose your way, and the chorus is just a yippee-yi-yay. Yippee-yi-yay, yippee-yi-yay. Thank you very much. Oh, if only all country and western songs were that short. From the sublime to the ridiculous, one last question. Do we have an identifiably New Zealand sound in composition? As we'll discover over the next few days, I don't think we do, in the sense that you could play pieces sight unseen and someone could identify which works were New Zealand and which weren't. Douglas Lilburn is often cited as having a New Zealand sound characterised by high, clear sounds reflecting the quality of light in this country, broad sounds reflecting the spaciousness of the landscape, and an undercurrent of emotional restraint reflecting the New Zealand male's traditional reluctance to express his feelings. We don't sing in the streets, and we tend to speak matter-of-factly with unmusical, flattened vowels and compressed inflections. Yeah, g'day. Interestingly, there does seem to be a shift in emotional temperature from about the mid-1990s onwards, coinciding with the rise of professionalism in sport. And like the onset of showmanship in this arena, indicative of a growing culture of flamboyance and excess rising in our modern post-Rogernomic society. Contrast the way Pine Tree Meads celebrated try-scoring in the 1960s with your average Super 15 show pony today, and you'll know exactly what I mean. Back then you could look at any of the All Blacks and have no idea which side had just scored. These days you're certain from the moment you see it. Related to this, in the mid-1990s, I was commissioned by New Zealand's Championship Barbershop Quartet to write a song celebrating how proud they were to be New Zealanders. They'd been invited to the Barbershop World Championships in the United States and wanted to take a song with them that reflected this sentiment, but couldn't find anything suitable. It was as if New Zealand composers had conspired to avoid composing anything in outright praise of their country. I was probably the wrong person to ask, but after much thought I came up with something, though not in the America the Beautiful way the quartet had perhaps first imagined. I don't happen to have a barbershop quartet with me today, but I'm sufficiently pleased with a portion of my lyrics to wish to share it with you. I feel it sums up the New Zealand into which I was born in 1953, the year Sir Ed knocked the bastard off and Queen Elizabeth was crowned. This New Zealand of my birth disappeared sometime in the mid-1990s, engulfed by globalisation, free marketeering, the rise of professional sport, and so on. Anyway, here's the opening stanza of my barbershop quartet, proud to call New Zealand home. There's not a lot of Kiwi songs that eulogise or praise the people or the countryside, the great New Zealand ways. It's something of a source of fun that visitors suppose, with one of us to 20 sheep, we've no time to compose. But no, it's that we're reticent, not eager to express through stirring words or haunting tunes accounts of our success. So while we'd like to share with you some patriotic tales, we can't, for as New Zealanders, our modesty prevails. With modesty intact, we'd like to state the simple fact we're proud to call New Zealand home. Yes, we really can't refrain from singing once again, we're proud to call New Zealand home. Finally, a brief coda on the theme of the conference. If you want to foster creativity, remember that creativity comes in many shapes and forms, as Michael alluded to earlier, and as such is often difficult to recognise. Creative minds swim against the tide of orthodox opinion and conventional wisdom. Be prepared to be surprised. Never be negative. Creativity is not craft or technique, it's an impulse to express and to be different in that expression. With creativity, there are no rules, no right ways, no wrong ways. Some of the worst teachers I ever had believed that there was only one way to skin a cat. As one of the worst students they ever had, I believed, and still do, that there are many ways to skin a cat, and still more waiting to be discovered. Incidentally, in case you're concerned, no animals were harmed in the making of that metaphor. Above all, share the delight of your students' creative discoveries, even though they've been discovered many times by others, probably. It'll help keep you young and allow you to rediscover the world of music again through their ears. That's it for me now. Until tomorrow, thank you for listening.